Welcome back. In this video, we'll be talking about what is tempo, prio, and pressure. These are very important terms that a lot of teams talk about and use when playing the games. They are the overall structure of how the game is played and what kind of movements and what kind of plans you make to apply these terms. When you talk about what is tempo, first, you have a description here. Tempo refers to the pace at which a game is played and the level of control a player or a team has over the game. Now, what does this even mean? The pace of the game and control over the game. What does it even mean? The first thing is understanding that League of Legends is actually a turn-based game. It goes back and forth, kind of like chess, where you set up for certain moves or you build up for certain openings while taking your turns. The reason why you apply this as turns as you often have to take bases, you have to reset, you have to buy items. Often when you then come out of the base, you refer as taking over the tempo of the game and controlling what is happening, because the remaining usual enemy team is still on the map, not having been able to take a base or haven't used your gold, which means the one of the team has an advantage of using their gold. Now, things that can apply into this is different drafts have different kinds of bases or different types of control. Now, say you have a typical early game draft, then you usually control the pace of the game more fluidly in the early game because of your champions are naturally strong and naturally spike earlier in the game. But even if you are a late game team comp, that means you, even though you're on tempo, maybe your champions are not that strong. That means you have less influence over the early game. You're sacrificing one part to spike even harder on another part. It's about knowing the differences there. Playstyle is also a thing. When you have a draft, you can play the different champions in the different styles in different ways. So that I also have a really important thing to say, and composition overall, where you can mix things between early game and mid game and late game champions. And this makes it easier to maybe see this is where we play for in the early game, this is what we need in the mid game, and etc. But to really understand what tempo is, you also need to understand what is pressure and what is prio. Pressure. What is pressure? There's two things. What is pressure and what pressure looks like. To understand how can you see what pressure is. Now, what pressure is? Creating situations that maximizes the chance of the opponents making a mistake that leads to team-wide advantage. That's what pressure is. Now, how can you visualize pressure when you make or do something in a game? What does pressure look like? Putting the enemy in a position where they have to choose between two bad outcomes. Now, what does this mean? Applying pressure. So, for example, when you are playing for a Drake, you want to be pushing waves and then moving into the river for then taking control. Now, why do you want to push the wave first? Because if the enemy wants control over the river, if you're first on the wave and push it in, then they need to choose between, do we want control right now? Do we want to go before the enemy? Or do we want to sacrifice the wave? That's a very simple thing. And that's why I always talk about take the wave and then make the decision. You push a wave and then you go with your team to either take control or apply pressure on the map. Because then the enemy has to choose between losing the minions and immediately responding to the play. Now, there are certain things that go against this I will talk about later here, is cheating tempo and prio and etc. But then prio, being able to assist your ally without having to sacrifice something, that is prio. You often talk about prio in the early game. Your jungler asks, do you have prio in this lane? Which means he's asking, if I need help, can you come to me without having to sacrifice something? And that often refers to you being able to freely push the wave in the lane and then helping your jungler. Now I'll also look at an example from a roleplay game between Vitality and Fnatic. Now we'll look at this from the perspective of Fnatic. If you see on the map, Cillian and Viego has come out of base and they're moving together through the Drake in the river to get control. Upset alone on Jhin is applying pressure on the bot lane by pushing the wave. He has control, you see. Their wave is more towards the enemy tower than is their own. Now Hylissang is also here, they want to help on pushing the wave. Another thing to notice is, because they have Prio in this lane, they can move freely without having to sacrifice anything. That means that Razor can start Drake. Another thing to note is that Humanoid doesn't get Prio in his lane. So what you will notice on the map is, in a few seconds, he will apply pressure by attacking Twisted Fate. And by attacking right now, he makes that Twisted Fate can't react, he can't push the wave instantly, and they're not able to move into the Drake, which means that Fnatic take it without having to lose anything. Now, another important concept I'll just mention in this video because it's so relevant is that often when you don't have control over an objective, for example this Drake, if you're Vitality, the first thing you want to do is assess, can we do something about this objective or can we cross map? And this also makes a very funny and interesting thing, as they're doing the correct thing, they're cross mapping, going to the other side of the map. But for most people watching LEC, they know what's going to happen.
He just hit 6. Cask is going to be big. How he uses it will decide a lot. Locked up, potentially going to get taken down. Body slam goes in. Cask goes in, knocking back Selfmade. Wonder buys a bit more time. Can wait, can get a little bit more damage. And the flash over! Oh my god, the footwork! Oh! Are they going to get him? No! Wonder! You absolute mad lad! You god amongst men! We have just...
And this makes a disaster. But then back again for this presentation about pressure, prio, and tempo. So what you see, there's examples of using your prio in bot lane, applying pressure in the mid lane, and acquiring the Drake for it. So how do we gain tempo? To gain tempo, you have to use the terms mentioned before and applying them to these scenarios. Setting up waves. What means to set up a wave? There's multiple things. You can push the wave to acquire instant prio in being able to move, but you can also set up what is called a slow push, where you have a wave that will slowly and gradually become bigger and bigger, which means it will slowly push towards the enemy, which at one point they need to react to it, or that big wave will crash under the tower and everything will die without the enemy being able to pick it up. Also, setting up base timers. What does it mean to set up base timers? What that means is that you have multiple people basing together. So even if you are on opposite side of the map, if your support and your jungler base at the same time, they can move out of base from the same place, move to the same lane, and start to play with multiple members. That's often why you want to use base timers. You want to be able to freely open the map with multiple members, which makes it hard for the enemy to react because either they are not on base timers or there are less members. If you have 3 versus 2, you often want to be the 3 people because it's easy to win against 2 people. And often then you can take control. Now, with this control over objectives, you want to push waves with multiple people, move in, and then you have basic control. This is what you do back and forth. If the Drake has not yet spawned, you go back to the mid lane, be the first team on the wave, you push the wave, and then you go back to take control. Trading effectively, as we also talked about, with Humanoid engaging on perks in the mid lane, trading to apply pressure, which means that Razor is completely free to take the Drake because nobody can actually react to it. And then the last thing is rotating effectively. Rotating means you push one wave from, say for example you're a top laner, you push the wave and then you run to mid lane to catch that wave. You rotate from top to mid while the rest of the team is maybe on Drake. You're catching multiple waves, applying pressure by having multiple members because you're the first one to move away from the top lane. Now, why do we talk about cheating tempo, and why do we have to do it? Now, if you are the enemy in these situations that we're talking about, where you're not the ones pushing the wave first, and say, for example, the enemy team has 3 drakes, okay, they're on soul point. Maybe you don't have time to take that wave, so you have to skip waves or set up a cheese. So, for example, by skipping the wave, you're just sacrificing the gold by the minions and running straight to the Drake, because you know the gold you lose is of less value than losing the soul point. That's why you want to contest it quickly. And that also happens because you make a lot of mistakes in the early mid game, which means you are in a situation where you have to sacrifice something. Another thing is fake basing. You go in fog of war and make the enemy think that you're basing, but instead you're setting up a cheese, you're setting up a play, which means if the enemy steps up, you will catch them off guard and being able to kill them, and then retaking tempo because they got killed out of a base timer. Now, there was a lot of information, but what is really important is having a checklist. These are really important things to be able to talk about when you are starting the game, to understand how you can apply pressure using Prio and understanding how you are using tempo in the game. You talk with your lanes about Prios. You talk about, do we win 2v2s and 3v3s in the different lanes if multiple members shows up? Can we set up anything level 1? How is our jungler pathing? What objectives do we want to play for, and how do we set them up? How do we team fight if the enemy are able to come in and they want to contest this objective? And overall throughout the game, what does the enemy want? I hope this video was informative, and I'll see you guys for the next one.